Everyone, it's Alex, and I am back with a brief little break of me visiting my hometown in West Virginia and also going on a little vacation with my friends, seeing them since like pre-pandemic. So it was a great time, and of all times, whenever we were all together, it was the beginning of Pride Month. So my friends, by obligation, had to be obsessed with me. I, of course, have to start this video with a fit check with this shirt. Through the span of having this booktube channel, I've never really had a dedicated video yet of just like LGBTQ reads or like gay literature or anything. So now that's what this video is, I'm hoping. So of course, that being said, with the title of this video, I know like queer theory exists and like English studies or whatever, but I clearly don't have any citations, so all of this is very subjective. But with LGBTQ plus literature, I always do find it really exciting and endearing because I always feel like it's constantly evolving. Both in the public eye and also just in the literary landscape, I feel like LGBTQ plus literature is a way of really being these artifacts of how people, like the public consciousness or the public perception of how gay people or people in the community are perceived or portrayed. And with gay literature as a genre, I think it really is something that's so heavily embraced whenever like embraced as a palette, which I feel like any book talk video would show you. And of course, I'm giving a very Western perspective of the acceptedness or how accepting it's becoming of LGBTQ people or the community in this aspect of being represented in literature. And to be honest, with the examples I plan to talk about today, I'm pretty sure the majority of them are just M to M or male to male relationships. So, of course, this is not meant to be comprehensive or really the most diverse set of being most representative. And so, with the title of this video, it really always makes me think of who are gay novels really for? Which is why for this first section, I have it being called For the Allies. I know there's that TikTok trend of movies that are gay but for straight people and movies that are straight but for gay people. And with books, I actually think that can be really similar. And so with this topic or this first set of books, I wanted to talk about The Great Believers by Rebbeca Makkai. This is a story about a man named Yale and his friends during the Chicago AIDS crisis. The book was actually a Pulitzer finalist for its year, and I think that really also speaks to the reinforcement of its historical context, since the book is about AIDS history and its representation of LGBTQ people in the community at this time during this tragedy. And while the book wasn't really a hit for me, I think what really is interesting about the book is its choice of part of its perspective being with this character named Fiona. Fiona is friends with Yale and his friends, but I feel like her stand-in as a character was much more to serve the grander purpose of the grander narrative of AIDS history, which is certainly important. In the process of characterization for Fiona, it does feel a bit lost on me, which is sort of ironic with this book because where it does follow a cast of characters, I feel like none of them really stood out to me as really fully realized people, which is kind of ironic considering how tragic this time is of so many people's personhood becoming lost since they're losing their lives throughout their youth during this horrible time. Similarly, another book I wanted to mention that follows the AIDS crisis is The Prettiest Star by Carter Sickles. The Prettiest Star is more concerned with the isolated experience versus a cast of characters approach like The Great Believers by following a man named Bryan as he moves back to Ohio from NYC. Unfortunately though, even with this fixation on Bryan alone, it still falls into that trap of Sickles feeling, in a way, I thought, obligated to follow this array of characters concerning Bryan's family that again makes the focus leave Bryan to where he just feels like a shell of his whole identity just being a gay man. Which there's nothing wrong with at all with that statement, but with the purpose of storytelling, I feel like Sickles really just used Bryan as a way to get more to the root of other characters like Bryan's mom or Bryan's sister, in a way feeling like it was this compensation for the lack of characterization between more unique or specific characters, trying to divvy it up and give it to everybody. And there is this interesting blur between Bryan's family having this anticipatory grief over the loss of who they remember Bryan as versus who Bryan is in the present. But unfortunately, I feel like I was pulling at straws to get those kinds of conclusions or those ways of me trying to feel like I was reading something that felt in a way, worth my time. So between The Great Believers and The Prettiest Star, they didn't exactly work for me, but I do think they're great books for the sense of perhaps anyone that isn't familiar at all with the history of LGBTQ communities, or also maybe literally even if a reader has never met like a gay person before. And while I think all of that is fine, I think it's still upon an author's responsibility to make both sides really compelling. One being a sense of character alongside its emphasis on story. So there are books that I have here that I think do a good job at that, while also promoting that historical context of the history of LGBTQ communities through character and more stronger storytelling. And along those lines, I feel like that's really reached based on maybe some common themes with gay literature, which I'm dubbing this next section as forbidden. So with this idea of a line being crossed, whether romantically or trying to not think or pretty much resist the idea of love, I think it's on the basis of these characters feeling perfectly situated within the time and place they find their predicament in. Really finding comfort and constraint, I would say, between this contrast with a heteronormative pedestal that they're trying to always keep in mind. At first, I wanted to mention Maurice by E.M. Forster, which is a story set in the early 1900s about Maurice and his growing sexuality with various men, but one specific connection with a man named Clive. What I love so much about Maurice is not only its emphasis on the differentiation between one's initial acknowledgement of sexuality, but also the liberty of trying to explore not with just one person, but seeing if that essence of surprise or recognition of sexuality is still there on the basis of exploring it with other people. Thus going beyond the deer in the headlights sense of love, but also on that basis of where it is about Maurice, the title character, I do feel like this book is also just as much about Clive. While Maurice and Clive explore their sexuality differently, Forster doesn't really demonize anyone for what path they choose, especially not sparing Maurice of his own folly of character. I personally found Maurice kind of like mean and even maybe like internally misogynistic, but I think in doing so, I think Forster smartly not only considers Maurice confrontation being about his sexuality, but also on the basis of where that angst comes from, perhaps like with details of Maurice's life having an absent father, maybe how Maurice feels like he's still trying to maintain that sense of masculinity of the time, with Maurice possibly thinking that to explore his sexuality is to also sacrifice his definition of masculinity. So yeah, Maurice is definitely a classic for a reason, so I would definitely pick it up. And the other book I wanted to mention for forbiddenness is A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. Set in the 1960s, we follow a character by the name of George, who we discover is grieving over the loss of his lover. And what I think is so interesting about this book is because I think with George's predicament of where we find him with his grief, I feel like the focus of LGBTQ relationships is sometimes initially on the basis of how to even attain one's relationship. So with George, it works kind of like a reset for him, as maybe people in the community aren't really taught or have the representation of understanding how to sort of reset yourself to losing one that you love and what that means for positioning where you are. If that even means having to go back to your initial conception of who you were before discovering your sexuality. If we imagine your sexuality is on the basis of linking it symbolically to another person. And what that means for being allowed to grieve publicly in a way of what that means for LGBTQ people. And of course, set in the 1960s, George is also concerned with his professional life, being a college professor, having to not make this recognition of his sexuality. And it becomes interesting too of perhaps how George considers the loss of a romantic relationship being the sacrifice of choosing to be a participant in this lifestyle. Or at least, I mean, as we know in like modern day, doesn't really matter, but in the 1960s, how something like, being gay was villainized or seen poorly. And between George's job and also his previous life, maybe falling back into the comforts of the default presence of what it means to be a man, even if that means maybe George feels like his lover's death is a consequence of, again, his life. I feel like most of what I said there about that book is more spectacle, but it is a book I really love and I think is similarly like Maurice, a very modern day gay classic, so I would definitely check that out too. So earlier when I mentioned things like heteronormative pedestal or thinking of a single man about this idea of what it means to live within this imagination of a realized relationship but not knowing what to do whenever that idea is gone, literally with the death of your lover. I think it really reinforces about how, in my opinion, LGBTQ plus people, whenever they're younger, they live within this dreamscape all the time of having to live or inhabit their imaginations more fully, mainly because I feel like between like media, it being largely heteronormative, it doesn't really have, or like people don't really have an outlet for imagining the execution of their desires or like something as little as having a crush on like a classmate or something. So appropriately, I would call this next section fantasy. While I think it can be fun to romanticize one's life, I think it's really interesting to really have this fine line between really having this very positive outlet of these dreamscapes or living within one's imagination of really wanting to fulfill what it means to maybe be in a relationship with someone that you feel like the heteronormative pedestal won't allow, but also being careful not to make like this imaginary pedestal of what it means to be in a LGBTQ relationship much like this heteronormative pedestal too. With these two books I wanted to mention, I think they do a good job at this sense of the imagination without really trying to say more like anything deep about what they're really trying to portray, but I think their themes are interesting about why people read them. This book was an absolute surprise for me, being so delightful because it really isn't afraid to dive into its uncanniness while also maintaining stakes. And what's so delightful about Red, White, and Royal Blue is that it has intentionally good circumstances for LGBTQ plus people. In an alternate universe in the 2010s in the United States, we have a president with a gay son, and his name is Alex. And another character we have is a very horny prince named Henry from across the pond. Between Alex and Henry beginning this kindling of a relationship, it is met with a lot of support. Namely, Alex mentioning this really funny part about how he would have known he was gay when he was younger because he was raised by Democrats. And overall, this book is really just concerned with the macro versus the micro. As Alex and Henry try to maintain their relationship, it becomes much more concerned about how they can really value their privacy in a very much more accepting and nosy world of the public eye of their power politically. So this book was really fun and I think really clever at really using this political prowess as a way to talk about things like social media or what it means to have a presence in the world, and less about condemning one's sexuality but just overall nosiness about one's love life and other stuff like that. So I found this book a complete delight, like I said. So I would really read it if you're looking for a really fun read. And the other book I have here is Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. And I don't really have anything too positive to say about it because I found it kind of underwhelming. But this book follows the story of Achilles with a retelling of Homer's The Iliad, except this time it's told from the perspective of Patroclus. And spoiler alert, but it is very gay. I'm pretty sure Song of Achilles came out around the rise of Greek retellings, but if anything, it's really caught a resurgence on platforms like TikTok, where I assume a bunch of people are reading it for the word of mouth, I would say, of 5% historical retelling intrigue and 95% smut. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course, but between Song of Achilles and Red, White, and Royal Blue, I think a lot of people are finding more comfort in really seeing these portrayals of the LGBTQ plus community within stories like this, where it feels like things are blown out of proportion, or at least acknowledging within certain ways of either retelling history or talking about positions of power with people in the community that are represented in these ways. It really is a refreshing spin of the doom and gloom of the narratives that we might be used to, like on the basis of The Great Believers and The Prettiest Star. And because where I think Red, White, and Royal Blue and Song of Achilles are concerned with positions of power, I think it really does emphasize this down-to-earth element of overall, no matter what, people are people with their own vulnerabilities waiting to sort of really champion that regardless, anyone discovering their sexuality is a very intimate experience that is really empathetic and sympathetic for readers alike with reading these very imaginary concepts of their lives. And finally, that leaves us with our final section, and I would call this section the future. I think it's becoming more commonplace that LGBTQ plus literature is becoming less niche as a genre, and people are just really wanting stories where LGBTQ plus people exist and they happen to be gay within their storylines introduced. So gone are the days of the simple will they, won't they, and here are the days of can we dismantle the heteronormative conception of the nuclear family? I obviously have to mention Detransition Baby by Torrey Peters, which I feel like I tried my best to articulate in my monthly wrap-up whenever I talked about it. But that's exactly my point, is that with the book's nuance, it really does try to introduce these challenges, or at least to me, it really challenged me on my own thoughts of what it means on an aspect of community and who's really representative in being in the LGBTQ plus community and who has space to dictate how that's defined or at least contributed towards. And being aware of one's sexuality is also against the social constructs of understanding the sort of approaches to sexuality having its own privileges. And Detransition Baby is about three characters with Reese, Ames, and Katrina. And this book especially highlights what it's like to be trans in a heteronormative world, but also trans within the community aspect of the LGBTQ plus community. And with this concept of community and the future and how I feel like it's always evolving on this sense of books like Detransition Baby, I also want to sort of mention maybe an origin to that, or at least a book that's older that I feel like was a good or is a good citation of these inklings of making me think about community, and that's A Dancer from the Dance by Andrew Holleran. Set in the 1970s, this is a book about a man named Malone who's moving from Ohio to NYC and really begins to explore the gay scene. And with Malone really considering how sexuality and desire are not synonymous, in a way, reading this, I feel like this book was really ahead of its time, with combating Malone's own sense of masculinity and possibly with his own internalized homophobia. And between whenever Malone meets another character named Sutherland, and really Sutherland and Malone's conversations reminded me a lot of Detransition Baby, or at least whenever I read Detransition Baby, I thought a lot about this book too. And with the third and final book I want to mention for this section, it is Memorial by Bryan Washington. Memorial didn't really hit all the spots for me, but I did want to mention it because I think it was a really refreshing book about two gay men of color being in a relationship with each other. And what I love about this book is that I don't think it really fits in romantic love as the sole sort of contribution to one's sexuality, as there's discussion of family and hookup culture, and my favorite probably being what it means to be two gay men of color in a white-dominated community, and how the sense of community within LGBTQ spaces is constantly evolving. And between Mike and Ben, our two main characters, how it feels like they're trying to catch up and be up to speed. And whether or not, with this book's main confrontation being whether or not Mike and Ben think they should still be together, it really normalizes that thought. And how Mike and Ben drifting apart isn't a failure, but a success of them both believing in each other, kind of drifting away from that heteronormative pedestal I mentioned earlier, where I feel like a wave of what is considered like a gay success is being able to find a romantic partner that matches the comparison to heteronormative society. It feels like through this book, I think it's nicely telling that to be gay, that the ultimate goal isn't necessarily to even be in a relationship. You can secure your own autonomy of not having to compare yourself to anyone at all, whether this heteronormative pedestal or the gay pedestal or any pedestals, I guess. So thinking of books like Detransition Baby and Memorial, and thinking back to books like Dance from the Dance, it really makes me excited to see how literature is going to try to catch up with the community itself, pumping out more stories that feel more inclusive and representative of what readers are craving, which is more evolved stories about what it means to be a part of this community. And what actually inspired this video is an old The Atlantic article by Garth Greenwell about a very specific novel, which is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. In 2015, shortly after A Little Life came out, Garth Greenwell presented this article about maybe this book, A Little Life, is the void of gay literature that we've all been waiting for. And it's really amazing how predictive that Garth Greenwell was at people really embracing this book labeling it as the great gay novel. Although for me, I really never, when I read A Little Life, I read this article after having read it, but I never saw it as a gay love story or a gay book at all. I would say, if anything on the spectrum, maybe something more related to pansexuality or asexuality. But Garth Greenwell is careful to mention this too, that the presumptions of this being a great gay novel is less about its demonstration of those attributes, but reinforcing how it feels like gay literature, in this case, if you're interpreting A Little Life that way, is that the genre itself of gay literature is becoming less and less niche, to where characters are allowed to feel like they just exist and maybe they do gay stuff. Garth Greenwell describes it perfectly by saying it feels less like gay characters, or at least characters represented in any way in the LGBTQ plus community, is less like they're being window shopped. And I agree, that's what makes A Little Life so compelling, with choosing to read it through these romantic gestures, but also how Garth Greenwell mentions that maybe it's the allusions toward suffering that this book has that people latch onto to recognize what it means to be gay, which is awful, but is certainly something that can be read through that perspective. So with the answer to the title of my video of what makes a gay novel, the answer is there is no answer, obviously. And again, as I mentioned before earlier in this video, I am excited to see exactly how we continue to sort of evolve this genre of becoming less niche, as Greenwell says, and really what other stories are just waiting and are in store. And of course, this video is not comprehensive to all the gay books I've read, but I would really love to know what books that you think would it fit into these sections that I concocted? Or in general, just what other books that you're thinking about, like for Pride Month, like Pride Month TBR or whatever else. I've really loved watching everyone's videos like that too. Also, sorry, you probably noticed a few times maybe that I sound a little congested. I'm coming back from a cold that I had, but hopefully I feel well enough by next week whenever I plan to do my Q&A video. So you're still welcome to leave questions in my previous video asking for questions, and also where I give some booktube shoutouts, so you can go check out those shoutouts too. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.